All right, good morning, people. Good to see you. I hope everyone's doing well. Um, I am going to again record a lecture, and we're going to cover and talk about the how we form our attitudes and how the environment, how our social influences help us to form our attitudes, our behavior, how we conform in group settings. And so we'll talk about that as it relates to, again, that social interaction that we've been talking about and how that influences us as people. So our attitudes, the behaviors that we exhibit, all of those things are influenced and impacted by group forces or social forces. So we usually make decisions based on what we think other people might think, or we have our beliefs based on kind of the environment that we grew up in. Many times, uh, say for instance, your mother or your father is a Democrat, right? Um, Even though you grew up in a household and you were able to see how they moved, you usually will have some of the similar beliefs that they have and some of the same attitudes, just based on you spending enough time with them. And even in some instances, um, there are families that have differing views about politics and other social issues. But more often than not, your influence and the influence that you have on the beliefs and your attitudes about certain things, especially social issues, um, different laws and situations that happen are influenced by your family and those who are close to you. So I'm going to go walk through the next few slides. Hopefully, it won't take too long, and then we'll get out of here and let you enjoy your weekend. All right, let me share my slides. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and do this. All right, so again, attitudes. Attitudes. We're going to talk about attitudes. We're going to talk about behavior, and how our group dynamics, the social interactions we have with people influence our attitudes and behavior and how we conform in groups. But the first thing we're talking about is making our social judgments. Like, why do we make certain judgments, make certain behaviors, and how are our attitudes influenced by people around us? Okay, and we began talking about this last class. All right. So again, when we talk about attitudes, we're talking about um, several different things. So attitudes are both positive and negative, right? And they evaluate different things. They evaluate people, they evaluate institutions, products, people, social issues, and our attitudes can be either positive or negative, right? And they are on a spectrum. For those who are really into basketball, right? You may have really, really positive attitudes about basketball, but others who may not be into sports may not enjoy looking at basketball games, right? So their attitudes about a particular sport may be different. We all have different attitudes about certain products that we consume, right? I buy certain brand of clothing, different shoes based on my attitudes on those products. A lot of times when an organization has maybe something that negative happens. I know when Papa John's was caught using racial slurs, individuals began to have a really really negative attitude about Papa John's, right? And maybe didn't patronize that restaurant because of what Papa John may have said, right? And so we have to be mindful of that, and things that happen and influence how we have attitudes about certain things. Attitudes can include three components. You have what we call the cognitive, the affective, and the behavioral. And we began talking about that last class, but the cognitive is just our belief, the belief we hold about a certain object or person or something that we're thinking about. The affective is the emotion that is stimulated by it, right? So I was a little upset when I heard about Papa John's making or having those racial slurs. And Tommy Hilfiger was another person who sells clothing, and his attitudes toward people of color, right, have this effective emotional feeling that stimulates when you're looking at his clothing line. And many people have kind of forgotten about those types of things. But again, in the moment, emotionally, we feel some type of way about it. When we saw President Obama, be elected for the first time, there was a huge pride, a sense of pride and emotional feeling when we saw that he was elected president. And then you have behavioral component, right? We're predisposed to act in certain ways based on the attitudes that we have. If we have a positive attitude towards a particular candidate, we're more likely going to vote for that candidate in the next election versus someone who we don't have a positive attitude about. So we behave in certain ways. If we have a positive attitude about a particular consumer product, right, we're more likely to buy those products, and then we'll buy them more often than if we were to have an object that we were not all that I guess an attitude was not all that great about it, okay. So these are the possible components of attitudes, right? Again, we talked about the cognitive component, talked about the affective component, the behavioral component, but all of these, again, are used to help to kind of change our behavior and how we behave in certain ways, okay? So when we talk about the components, we're talking about, again, the affective, we're talking about the beliefs, the cognitive, and then the behavioral. You have different strengths of attitudes, right? So the stronger your attitude on certain issues, certain objects, the more you're going to be really passionate about that thing, right? And it's going to be really, really, really resistant to change. The accessibility, right, of an attitude refers to how often you think about it, right? So we have, different clothing items that we buy and wear all the time. I love Jordans. I love certain clothing lines, and so that stuff is more accessible to me, right? So I think about it more often than I think about other clothing, right? Ambivalent. So these are attitudes that are kind of conflicted. We both have positive and negative feelings about certain objects, and that happens oftentimes where, some characteristics about a person are really, really great, and then others aren't. And so we have these conflicting attitudes or evaluations of different people. And so we may like a certain person in certain ways, but then when we see a different part of their personality, we're a little conflicted in how we feel about that person, right? Our attitudes, the way we feel, the emotions, they are pretty mediocre predictors of behavior. We'll talk about that. If we look at how our attitudes are, and then the behavior that we exhibit, it's about 0.41 of a correlation. So that means that there's a moderate strength in how attitudes influence our behavior and how we behave, how we act, right? But then people fail to factor the influence of attitude strength, right? So I can't really. I know how you might behave towards certain things based on your attitude, but I don't know the strength of that. I don't know the magnitude of that attitude. I don't know how much influence. Right? I know that you have an attitude about it, but I don't know how much it's going to influence you one way or the other. But again, behavior and the way we behave is really influenced by the situations we are in. We'll talk about that, right? So though we might have an attitude about something, right? Back in high school and middle school, if we're being peer pressured to smoke, and we have this attitude about smoking that's bad, then we may not have the opportunity to stop from doing it if we're peer pressured, right, during in a group setting, right? So we have to be really mindful of that. In certain situations, if we're around a group of friends, we may end up smoking, even though we have this attitude against it because of the situation that we were in, okay, and the pressure that we feel from our peers. Okay, but again, how well do attitudes predict behavior? Again, like we talked about before, pretty mediocre. In a study done about 797 attitude behavior studies, they found that on average, there was a correlation between attitudes and behavior around 0.41, which is pretty moderate. If it was more about 0.7 or above, then that's a pretty strong indication that our attitudes really, really influence our behavior. But since it's more on the moderate side and more weak, again, we don't oftentimes hold attitudes that really influence our behavior. Okay. So beneath the surface, what happens beneath the surface? So we have what we call explicit attitudes, and then we have what we call implicit attitudes. And we talk about that a lot of times when we're talking about, especially recently, when we're referring to like police brutality, right? So individuals hold these explicit attitudes, right? These are consciously, you can readily describe them, right? So if you were to describe your favorite athlete or your favorite actress or artist, right? You could explicitly say, hey, uh, they're really musically inclined. I love the way they dress. They are extremely attractive, right? And then you have some implicit attitudes about individuals as well. These are those covert attitudes that aren't easily expressed. They're pretty subtle, and then they're the kind of automatic responses over in the kind of little conscious control over them, right? So for us, the implicit attitudes, if versus in group versus out group, like we talked about on the previous classes, right? If I'm talking about another racial group, right, I have these explicit attitudes about them, right? I know that maybe they're really outgoing, they're really charismatic, right? But I also know implicitly that I'm not that trusting of them, right? I have this implicit attitude about them and who they are, right? So many people express the explicit attitudes, right, that they condemn prejudice, right? But unknowingly, they harbor implicit attitudes that reflect subtle forms of prejudice, right? Those prejudice are those attitudes that we hold towards people. A lot of times, I have a lot of white friends, and so on the outward, right, they have explicit attitudes about me, but oftentimes there are some subtle forms of prejudice that they harbor on the inside, right, that they aren't readily expressing, right, that we can just based on their behaviors and how they treat us, we can kind of tell, okay, they have a certain feeling about us and attitude about who we are as people. Okay. There is a study that Harvard has done, and I want us to do it. And we're gonna start this next week. We're gonna go through a demonstration next week talking about the implicit attitudes. But we all have implicit attitudes and have implicit bias. And this Harvard project, Harvard project implicit, it shows that there's an implicit association that we make for certain people, for certain groups, right? 80%, and the research has shown from these particular attitudes or particular demonstrations that 80% of the respondents show a negative implicit attitude about the elderly, right? That's a lot of people who have engaged in these different attitude assumption tests, and 80% of those persons show a negative implicit attitude towards elderly people. So 75% of white respondents exhibit implicit prejudice against Black people, right? Again, so these tests show that we have these implicit attitudes about certain groups. And lastly, it says implicit prejudice against homosexual persons, the disabled, and the obese are very, very common. So even though we explicitly might say we accept them, we are for them, but implicitly, unconsciously, we have these and harbor these biases and prejudices against different groups. Okay. So what are the effects of implicit bias, right? So within a higher implicit racism score, white subjects are really more associated to decrease smiling when they interact with us, reduce eye contact, and they have shorter speaking times with individuals in interracial interactions, right? So these are been shown over and over again that the implicit attitudes really influence our behavior and how we treat other people. And it's not explicit. Oftentimes they show maybe some microaggressions. Again, those micro behaviors that aren't really all that conscious, but unconsciously they act in a certain way. Implicit prejudice also predicts discrimination in hiring, right? So if we're looking at an all-white, panel that's looking to interview an individual, right? There are, again, discrimination in hiring practices, negative attitudes about immigration, and an aggression towards and in response to provocation, right? So there's a higher level of aggression when individuals feel like they're being provoked, right? And so we have to be mindful of that when we're dealing with people in other groups, okay? So beyond the realm of prejudice, implicit attitudes about math predict interest and performance in math, and implicit attitudes about political candidates predict voting behavior, right? So for instance, there have been stereotypes that individuals in different ethnic groups are a lot better at math than others, or in different gender groups, right? So individuals have said that, men are better at math than females are. And that's just an implicit attitude. That's a stereotype that people hold over the course of time, but that's not actually true, right? But we have these implicit attitudes. So math instructors or math professors may treat male participants differently than they treat female subjects or female students, right? Based on those implicit attitudes. And so we have to be mindful of that, and we have to check ourselves to make sure that we are being really conscious about our behaviors and how those might be influencing people around us. Okay. So when we have these implicit attitudes, like how do we change them, right? How are we persuaded? How are we changed based on the attitudes that we have? So it's really not easy to change other people's attitudes, right? So even with a lot of training or a lot of lectures, it's really really difficult. But it does not stop people from trying to change people's attitudes about certain people, about certain topics, about certain objects, right? There are four things and four variables that influence the persuasion of a particular thing, right? There are four things. You got the source, the message, the channel, and the receiver. And there's a diagram below that kind of shows how those things flow from one variable to the next, right? So the biggest thing that we look at when we're looking at someone being persuaded is who is the source, right? Who is the source of what's being spoken, right? If for those of us who are go to church, right, we are more likely to look at the source, right? If we were looking at an individual who had a robe on and it was in the church pulpit, right, they would be more credible. They look like they'd have more expertise and be a little more trustworthy than someone who would just be speaking on the street corner, right? So we'd be, again, more persuaded maybe by those who look a little more and look the part. Those who are a little more attractive, right? We look at as being more likable, and also those who are more similar to us, right? So if I have an individual who is, a person of color, I'm going to listen to them a little more intently than if it was someone who was of a different racial and ethnic group, right? Just based on those things, those kind of play a factor in who the source is, right? The second thing is the message. The message. How is the message being presented to me? Is there a lot of repetition? That's why when you're listening to a commercial, there's a lot of repetition in the commercials. They want you to hear the message over and over and over again. You might hear it 3 or 4 times over and over again, so it gets embedded in your mind, right? And so you have to look at that based on, again, what the message is, how they're presenting it to you, and again, the message is really really important. Are there a lot of strong arguments for why you should change your mind based on a particular attitude? Right? The second thing is the channel. And that plays a big role in, are they in person? Right? Are you hearing this on radio or television? Right? Is it kind of audio taped or via the computer, maybe via Skype or Zoom, right? In-person interactions oftentimes are a little more persuasive than, say, someone on television or radio. But when you have YouTube channels, when you have YouTube and TikTok and Snapchat, all those things help because, again, it provides you with, again, more and more opportunities to present a message. And then the last thing is to whom. So the receiver plays a big part too. If a person has a really, really strong attitude about something, it's going to be extremely hard for them to change their attitude, right? So again, how big or how strong is that strength of that pre-existing attitude, right? If they are really, really strongly against guns, it's going to be really hard to sell them on, relaxing the gun laws in the United States. They're going to be really, really gun ho about, no, we need to restrict individuals from, again, having guns in our community, right? But again, depending on the person, depending on the generation, depends on how they receive the message. Okay, so again, persuasion has, again, those four variables: source, message, channel, and receiver. Okay, so it says, which of the following is a receiver factor that influences the source's ability to persuade? Right? If we think about that, that is going to be the initial attitude on the issue. Right? So the initial attitude on the issue is based on the receiver, right? So if they have a really strong attitude about it, it's going to be tougher to alter their attitude based on it being embedded in their beliefs and their values, right? So it's going to require a whole lot of persuading whole lot of persistence to try to change the way they think and attitude about a certain topic. Okay. So here is how we form our attitudes, right? So here are some theories about how we form our attitudes and then how we change our attitudes, right? So the biggest thing that we learned about in the learning chapter um, earlier in the semester was, again, attitudes can be learned, right, through various means. The first one is evaluative conditioning, right? So think about someone on a commercial, someone we really admire, a famous spokesperson. You're going to be you're probably going to be very persuaded. Your attitude might change based on what they say, right? So say they're trying to sell you a luxury vehicle, right? Maybe a Porsche or a Lamborghini or another high-end luxury vehicle. You're probably going to change your attitude about a particular vehicle based on that person, because again, you're evaluating the person who's telling you about it, and if that person you really admire, you might be a little more apt to change your attitude. Operant conditioning. So your attitude is reinforced by other people, right? So you're in a group setting. You have a group of friends, and all of you like A-Town wings, right? So initially, your attitude for A-Town wings wasn't all that strong, but over the course of time, my friends go to A-Town wings, my family go to A-Town wings, and so now my attitude towards it and my liking of A-Town wings is being reinforced by other people around me. Right? And the last thing is observational learning, which also ties into what could be operant conditioning, right? We just observe people over the course of time, and my parents have beliefs about maybe being democratic beliefs, and those become mine because I've observed them over the course of my life, and so the way they act towards certain candidates, I also begin to act towards those particular candidates. Okay. The second thing is a dissonance theory. And this dissonance theory is based on the concept of kind of an inconsistency among attitudes that propel people in a direction of attitude change, right? So this happens when my attitudes and my behaviors are kind of in conflict, and I have this tension, right? So I'm a smoker, right? But I also know that smoking is bad, right? So there's this tension that I enjoy it, it feels good, but I also know that my grandmother died of lung cancer, and it was because she was a smoker. So now I have this tension because I want to smoke, but I also know it's bad for me, right? So this cognitive dissonance is what creates that tension, right? So the cognitive dissonance that we talk about it exists when we have these related attitudes and the beliefs contradict one another, right? So we have these beliefs and our attitudes and our behaviors are all contradictory, and it creates this tension. And people try to relieve this tension in a lot of different ways, right? So we reject the beliefs altogether, right? Try to explain away why we do certain things, or we try to avoid new information, right? So I see a commercial coming on about lung cancer and the ills of smoking, right? So I just flip the channel really, really quickly, right? Or I avoid any information, any articles that are explaining why smoking is bad for me. So I either I reject the notion that it's bad. I try to explain away, well, all my friends do it, right? So I might as well do it, right? It just explain away the issue and the tension, right? The other thing is effort justification, right? So this is when people justify efforts that haven't panned out. It's the example I like to use all the time is sometimes we come to love what we suffer to achieve, right? That's why certain groups that we want to join, the harder or the more difficult that group is to join, the more we want to join the group, right? And the more we have, we strengthen our attitude about that group, right? So, for those in sororities and fraternities who want to, get into fraternities and sororities, the difficulty in getting into a sorority or fraternity makes you love it that much more, right? Because when you achieve it, you have this affinity toward them. You have this draw, this brotherhood, this sisterhood. All of us went through this really, really tough time to get there. And now since we've achieved it, we have this really, really strong love and affinity towards that particular group. And we justify the effort for the difficulty it takes to achieve, right? And so we kind of make those situations work for us as we justify the effort for certain things, right? It could be getting into a really difficult school, right? So getting your degree, right? We go through certain things, and it's really, really difficult to get that bachelor's degree. but we stick with it because we know that achieving it, again, it's a really, really big achievement, and the effort is justified based on the big achievement that we're going to be getting at the end. Okay. Here are some cognitive dissonance examples. Smoking cigarettes, like I talked about before. So we have a behavior that we're exhibiting, and we also have the beliefs that smoking is bad. And so there's this tension that is formed there. And oftentimes, especially for smokers who, again, you maybe have something out, and you maybe a family member who has died from smoking, from lung cancer, and you're like, you know what, let me change my behavior because I want to reduce that tension. So I change. I try to reduce the amount of cigarettes that I smoke a day. Right? Fake news is something that we avoid any new information. Right? We believe what we believe. Right? It might be fake, so we stop trying to receive any information that might be counter to the information that we're really believing, right? And then the second thing is peer pressure, right? So we just try to justify it, right? We explain our behavior, right? All my friends are drinking, my friends are smoking, and if everybody else is smoking, I might as well smoke. I don't want to be looked or frowned upon that I'm a lame, I'm a square, you know what I'm saying? So I want to be a part of the group because there's this tension if I don't do it, okay? And then here are some other attitudes or theories of attitude formation and change. What we call the elaboration likelihood model. And this was founded by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, excuse me. Okay, so there are two routes to persuasion. Right? You have what we call a central route, and we have a peripheral route. And I like to use candidates or political candidates to kind of explain this level of persuasion. So the central route, people carefully ponder the content and the logic of persuasive messages. So this is, you have a candidate and they are giving you the facts. They're giving you, their points and what they hope to change as a candidate, right? They're giving you everything that you want to hear, right? And so they're giving you we're going to be doing this on different laws. We're going to improve the cafeteria. We're going to make the campus more accessible to those who are disabled. We're going to give everybody free laptops, and we're going to make this place a better place, right? But the peripheral route, this is when persuasion depends on those non-message factors, such as a candidate's attractiveness or the credibility of their source, right? That's why a lot of the candidates, they'll have this big fanfare, right? They'll bring in different groups to represent them. They'll have different spokespersons, different celebrities that'll speak for them and speak in support of them, right? So that they have those non-message factors, those individuals who bring the big fanfare. They have all the music and the fireworks and all the big stuff to help draw you in. And it's those non-message factors that help sometimes make them a more attractive and more credible source, right? Attitudes change usually through the central process more often than anything, right? So they lead to more enduring attitude change, right? So when I'm looking at the facts, I'm looking at the content and the logic of your persuasive messages, it digs deep on the inside of me. And it leads more to enduring attitude change. When we have the central processes, that more logic, more content I'm looking at, I'm more resistant to change. And then when we're looking at the central process, that is more predictive of better behavior or behavior better than the peripheral route, right? Because we know that, all the fanfare, all the music and the celebrity spokespersons, they aren't everything that's tied into what that logic and that content is, right? We know we can kind of get past that, right? But when we know somebody is genuine, they're got the facts, they're really credible, then we're more often to vote for them based on their central route, the content and the logic of the message. Okay. So we talked about attitudes, we talked about those different theories of attitude change. And so now let's talk about conformity, our behavior. We yield to others more often than we think we do. And that, when we talk about cognitive dissonance, this goes into peer pressure, right? When we have a large group of people who are around us and they're doing or participating in a certain behavior, we have this pressure, this tension to do the same, right? We're in a group of people and they're smoking. We're more likely to smoke if there are a lot more people smoking than if there aren't, right? Because again, that tension that we feel on the inside, this is kind of a force, it's a social force that we feel when we are in group settings, okay? So conformity, why do we conform and what is conformity, right? So conformity is the tendency for people to yield to real or imagined social pressure, right? So on social media, we see different trends. We see different dance trends, um, different things happening on social media, TikTok, YouTube, um, Snapchat, and we're conformed. We conform to that, right? So with the line dances, when we see them online, we don't want to be the person that does not know the line dance. We don't want to be the person that is not in the know, right? If we see people, talking about a particular show that they see that's seen on Netflix, we're likely not going to not watch it. Are we going to watch it? Because again, we want to be in the know. We're going to conform to that social pressure. So people tend to conform in certain situations, and we'll talk about that. Group size and group unanimity are key determinants of conformity, right? So the larger the amount of group, the larger the group, and the group unanimity are the key determinants, right? So if it's a unanimous thing, right? If more people are doing it, we're probably going to fall in line with doing it, right? If I got a lot of a large group, group friends, I'm going to probably follow along. If everybody says they want to go to KFC and I want to go to Popeyes, but it's 10 people in my group friends, right? And they say they want to go to KFC, I'm probably going to go to KFC because of unanimity, right? There are more people who want to do certain things, and the group size is going to force me to want to do it. Okay. Well, we have what we call a normative influence, and we have what we call an informational influence. The normative influence is when the effect that promotes conformity to social norms for fear of negative social consequences, right? So again, if you got people that are binge watching a particular show and you got all your friends who have watched this show and you're the only one that hasn't watched it, you're probably going to watch it because there are negative consequences for not watching it. You're gonna be the one not having anything to say about this show, right? So you're gonna watch the show just because your friends watch it, right? You may feel pressure to smoke because all of your friends are smoking, right? That happens more often than not, and that's what we call that peer pressure, right? That's that conform to those social norms for fear of the negative consequences. And I don't want to be talked about. I don't want to be talked about as someone who does not smoke, right? I don't want to be that person, right? So I go ahead and do it because of those social norms. And then the informational influence, like so, this effect is often contributes to conformity in which people look to others for guidance, right, about how they should behave in ambiguous situations. I don't know if anybody's ever been to a really, really fancy restaurant. They have, the salad fork, the meal fork, the dessert fork. They have like three different spoons. They have, the butter knife. They have the knife you use for cutting things, right? All of these different silverware, and I'm like, where do I start, right? So instead of just using the fork for the salad first, I look to my left, and my right to see who's using what for the salad, who's using what for the entree, and looking at the other people around me to see, okay, how I should be behaving, right? Or maybe I'm going to a basketball game for the first time, NBA basketball game for the first time. I've never been to one, so I have no clue. This is kind of an ambiguous situation for me. So I'm looking around like how other people acting, right? Do I need to go get a beer or a hot dog, or do I need to cheer? Like, what do I need to do, right? What do I need to wear, right? So I look at you know uh, videos or pictures beforehand to see what I need to wear to a basketball game. I wouldn't go to a basketball game in a suit, right? I would go maybe in a basketball jersey or a T-shirt that had the team name on it, right? So you want to make sure that you are using the information of people around you to behave in what we call the proper way. Okay. So a couple studies have been done to study conformity, and we use the group size, we use unanimity to talk about those social norms, that social pressure. So Solomon Ash experimented by investigating the extent to which social pressure from a majority group could affect a person to conform. And so what he did was he used 50 male students for Swarthmore College, and kind of USA participated in the vision test, right? So they participated in this vision test, or what they thought was a vision test, and what it actually was it was a They were looking at particular lines on a board, and I'll show you an example next. And there were some Confederates. So there were 7 Confederates or 7 actors. They were a part of the study, but the participant had no clue that they were a part of the study. They didn't know that they were just actors, right? So this person, a naive person, they are the participant, and they are using a line judgment task, right? So they're looking at one line, and they have 3 lines, and they have to match to see if that one line matches the length of another line. I'll show you an example next to give you an idea. So he devised this classic experiment whereby the obvious answer, right, to a line judgment task is there, right? But what happened was he would have the actors give the wrong answer, right? So this experiment had 18 trials, right? So out of the 18 trials, 12 of those trials were incorrect answers, right? The other 6 were correct answers. But those 12 trials, he made the Confederates say the wrong answer. The obvious answer was there, right? But again, the conformity was seeing if the participant would go ahead and go along with the wrong answer, right? Even though the obvious answer was on the screen, right? So if the participant gave the incorrect answer, this would be a clear indication that the group pressure made him conform to giving the incorrect answer. Because again, even the answers were obvious, and I'll show you next the obvious answer, right? So again, this is kind of what the participant saw, right? So he was last in order, right? So he had 7 participants before him. He was the last one to give his answer, right? So the first 7 would give maybe the wrong answer. So obviously you see the standard line, and you can see the comparison line, and you can see that the comparison line 2 would be the one that is the correct answer, right? But they would go through those 7. The 7 would say 1. All of them would say 1 or 3. And then they would wait for the participant at the end, and he would say 1 or 3, right? Based on everybody else's wrong answer. Okay. You would think, right, that you would say 2 every time because it's the obvious answer. But again, when group influences you, right, there's pressure. And so you oftentimes go with the group based on you don't want those negative consequences, right? So obviously you would say 2 again every time. If you were by yourself, you would say 2 every time, right? But in a group setting, you're likely going to say and go along with the group. Okay. So again, Ash measured the number of times each participant conformed to the majority view, and on average, about 1/3 of the participants who were placed in this situation went along with and conformed with clearly incorrect majority on the clinical trials, right? So over the 12 clinical trials, about 75% of the participants conformed at least one time. They conformed at least one time, and 25% never conformed at all. But again, that is a big percentage. So 3/4 of the people out of those 50 individuals, out of those 50 males, 75% of them conformed at least one time out of those 12 clinical trials, right? And in the control group, so the control group had no pressure, there was nobody around them. They didn't conform, they didn't have anybody to conform to, right? So less than 1% of the participants gave the wrong answer, right? So 99% of the time, they gave the correct answer, right? So again, you see that group pressure, again, helps and makes people conform. Even though we think we wouldn't, oftentimes we do based on maybe the size of the group. So say maybe the group grew in size from maybe 7 to maybe 20, right? And so you'd probably go along with a lot more often, again, with the size of that group, okay? The other thing that we talk about is obedience, right? And so how will we behave to certain people, right, when there is an authority figure around us, right? So the goal of this study, we talked about this when we talked about ethics, right? So the goal of the study was to see how we obey authority figures, right? So the first, they told the participants that they were going to be participating in a learning experiment, right? And they had accomplices to help as actors to work through to kind of get this experiment to work the way they wanted to, right? So as the learning experiment proceeded, the accomplice made many mistakes, right? So the person on the other side was the learner, and every time the person was participating in the actual subject, he was the teacher. So every time the teacher heard a wrong response, he had to shock the learner And again, the learner he wasn't getting any actual shock, but he made it seem like he was being shocked, right? And so each time the learner got an incorrect answer, the teacher was instructed to increase the shock level after each wrong answer, right? And the person in the room that was kind of guiding the experiment was also a part of the experiment himself, right? So he was the authority figure. He had a white coat. He was the experimenter, right? And so he would tell the person every time the learner gets it wrong, you increase the level of shock. And again, you want to make sure that you are increasing it every time, right? And we'll talk about the results of the study, right? Milgram replied, right? Because again, how do we make sure that this is, this is generalizable to the real world, right? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But we can see that even in our real lives, we're going to conform and obey authority figures oftentimes, especially if we feel like they are credible, if we feel like they can be trusted, right? And we feel like, they have a good sense of who they are as people, right? So we can kind of get a feel for who they are if we trust them. Even attractiveness, right? If they're a lot more attractive, if we feel like they know what they're talking about, we're more likely to obey authority figures, right? So the results of this study, right? Even though the people giving the shocks, the participants in the study, even though they voiced and displayed distress about harming the learner, right? 65% of those participants administered all 30 levels of the shock. The last level of this shock, I mean, you're talking about 450 decibels, right? Like that's death, right? That's death. And 65% of all of the participants they administered all 30 levels of the shock. That is very, very big when we talk about obedience, right? So Milgram argued that strong pressure from an authority figure can make decent people do indecent things to others, right? So we have to be mindful about how we are being influenced by other people. And I think we talked about it at the beginning of the class. We're like, do you think if you were in this similar situation that you would give those shocks to those people? Many of you are like, no, I wouldn't. Even though the guy was telling me to keep going, I probably wouldn't do it. And not knowing, right? If you were unaware, like right now, knowing the experiment, you probably wouldn't do it. But again, I think many of us, if we were in that same situation, we were unaware of what the actual experiment was about, we probably would give the greatest number of shots, right? And again, we just never know what kind of situation would cause us to obey and harm people in certain situations. Okay. So conformity and obedience are, again, not unique to American culture, right? There have been replications of the Milgram obedience study, and again, have reported similar or even higher obedience rates in other industrialized nations. You think about in more collectivist societies, they want to, again, appease the group, right? So they want to do what's best for the group setting, right? So it's possible that those who are a little more collectivist, right? Maybe those who are more, especially like in Hispanic society, they're more group and culture oriented, right? They're probably more likely to go along with, doing what's best for the group based on being obedience to an authority figure, right? A lot of times, individuals in a little other ethnic cultures, right? They take obedience to authority very, very seriously, and so they don't really ask a lot of questions. They don't question the authority figures. They go along with it because, again, they are about group dynamics and improving group cohesion. There have also been replications of the Ash experiment, right, and have found somewhat higher levels of conformity, especially in collectivistic cultures, rather than individualistic cultures, right? So you can get a feel for this, right? Again, if I am more for group conformity, then especially in collectivist societies, I'm going to go along with the answers of the group versus individualistic societies where I'm more of my own person and I don't have as much tension as those in collectivist societies to go along with the group. Right? I want to be different, right? So I'll probably say the correct answer, even though people around me are giving me the answer. Okay. So behavior in groups, right? Joining in with others, right? That's the biggest thing. We talked about peer pressure. We talked about conforming. We talked about our attitudes and how our attitudes are influenced by others. But here is our behavior. How are our behaviors influencing how we are and how we move. Okay. So behavior alone versus behavior in groups, right? This is what we call the bystander effect, right? So when we talk about behavior alone and in groups, a group can be two or more individuals who interact and are interdependent on one another, right? So the bystander effect is a phenomenon where people are less likely to provide needed help when they are in groups than when they are alone. So there are instances, and there have been experiments where a person is in distress, right? And maybe they are they're Confederate, they're an actor, and maybe they feel they're looking like they're having a heart attack, right? Or they're looking like they're being mugged by somebody. But let's go with the heart attack, right? So a person's having a heart attack and they are in a huge group setting, right? They're in a huge group setting, right? When the group is very, very large, the likelihood that somebody's going to help that individual who is in distress decreases, right? So it says the probability of getting help declines as the group size increases, right? But as the group size decreases, the probability of you getting help increases, right? So depending on the amount of people, right, depends on whether or not you're going to help that person, right? So if somebody looks like they're in distress, then again, you being in a group of people, you're like, oh, they got it. So I'm gonna go ahead and just watch because I think somebody else will take care of it. So I'm just gonna keep on walking because I know I got all these people around me. I know somebody's gonna take care of it, right? But everybody else is having that same mentality. Everybody else is like, okay, there's so many people around here. Somebody's got to help. Somebody's got to help this person, right? So we have to be mindful of that when we are in groups, because when we see somebody in distress, we have to be mindful that other people might not help because they feel like everybody else around them will. Right? And then we diffuse the responsibility that occurs in a group set situation, right? So I'm just like, it's not, I got all these people out here. I don't have to help them because I'm pretty sure somebody else will, right? So I diffuse the amount of responsibility on myself to everyone else, okay? But again, when I'm alone, I'm probably more likely to help them because I don't see anybody else. I can't diffuse the responsibility and put the responsibility on anybody else. The responsibility is on me to help that person, okay? Social loafing is another one, right? This often happens in a lot of big group settings, right? Sometimes I don't like group projects because social loafing plays a big role in group projects. So social loafing is a reduction in the effort by individuals when they work in groups as compared with when they work by themselves, right? So you're more likely to give a lot more effort if it's your grade versus you having a grade that is dependent upon a group setting, right? So you might have some people in a group that aren't pulling their weight, right? They're loafing, right? Because again, they're reducing their effort based on the effort of everybody in the room. So what is really helpful in group settings is everybody has a specific responsibility, right? If you give everybody a specific responsibility, then you're less likely to see a lot of social loafing, right? So again, I don't want to diffuse all the responsibility in the group. I want to make sure that everybody has an explicit role and explicit responsibility. So they can't just diffuse their responsibility on everybody else in the group. When you get into a group setting and you just let everybody kind of just do what they want to do, then you're going to get individuals who just kind of slow, right? Because you're going to have people in the group who work extremely hard anyway. And that is the absolute worst because those persons who are a little less effortful, right? They're gonna let you do your work, right? And they're just gonna sit back and get that grade, right? Social loafing again is not inevitable, right? Just based on how you set your group dynamic up, right? Because again, that potential productivity can be influenced by again how you coordinate the group. If you coordinate it really, really great, right, you're probably going to get a great level of productivity. But if you don't, the productivity in the group is going to be declined, right? So again, you look at the potential productivity with a size of 1, looking at the chart here, right? With a size of 1, the effort, again, is going to be great. Productivity is going to be great. But as you increase the size of the group, right, that productivity begins to wane, right? So the pressure per person begins to die off. And then again, the coordination and that productivity, the effectiveness of the group begins to die. Okay. So what happens when we're making decisions in groups? So we know what happens when, what forces behaviors. What about decisions, right? So group polarization is a phenomenon. It occurs when we're discussing or discussing strengths of groups, there's a dominant point of view and produces a shift towards a more extreme decision in that direction. So when we talk about group polarization, if I'm in a group, like we were talking about, um, if all of my friends want to go to, well, let's say I like French fries. Say all of our friends want to go to Popeyes, right? And I'm the only one in the group that wants to go to KFC. We're all making these good points about why KFC is better, why is Popeyes better, and eventually your points outweigh my points, and I'm like, you know what, your strengths um, are outweighing mine, so I'll go ahead and eat some Popeyes, right? Spicy chicken is great, so let me go ahead and get Popeyes, right? Groupthink is another thing, right? It's a process in which members of a cohesive group emphasize concurrence at the expense of critical thinking and arriving at a decision. So this happens a lot when you're in a group setting and everybody in this group is thinking the same thing, right? And you can fall victim to this when you got this us versus them mentality, right? This hurts a lot of groups because when you run into a problem, everybody's thinking the same way and you don't have a different perspective, you can't solve a lot of different problems and your critical thinking skills decrease, right? So it's really, really important that you improve your different perspectives. You allow different perspectives in because when you do that, then you are able to better arrive at better decisions, right? But when you have groupthink, everybody's thinking the same thing. You got this confirmation bias. I think that all gummy bears are good, and we all think the same thing. But there are other candies that we should be exploring, right? Again, we have to be really mindful of that because when you have high group cohesion, you're going to have high group think, and that is not always good because when you run into an issue, it's good to have people who are thinking differently so that you can come to a really critical and better decisions. Okay, group cohesion obviously is the strength, right, of the liking relationships linking group members to each other, right, and to the group itself. So if you have really, really great group cohesion, that's when it's really important, especially when you have a team, right? Teams are really, really great, especially when you have really group cohesion. Everybody likes each other. Everybody's wanting the group to succeed. That happens a lot when you have a championship team. They have great group cohesion. They like their relationships. Everybody's linked together. Everybody likes each other, and they're working together for a common purpose, right? And so they're going to make decisions that are for the betterment of the group, and that's what you want. You want really high group cohesion, but there's a negative side to this because if you have really, really good cohesion, high group cohesion, you can also have high group think. And that just makes it that much different. It makes it that much harder and more difficult to change the attitudes of those group members when you have really, really high group cohesion and really, really high group think. It makes making decisions and thinking critical very difficult. Okay. So here's a knowledge check. It says, when is groupthink more likely to occur? Okay, it says when there is little group cohesion, when the group works in relative isolation, when there is no clear group leader, when significant time is given for the decision-making process. Okay, this one is B. Okay, so it says when the group works in relative isolation. All right, so it says members of cohesive groups are close knit and committed, have team spirit, and are loyal to the group. Cohesiveness itself isn't all that bad. It can help, right? Groups achieve great things, but Janice maintains that danger of groupthink is greater when groups are highly cohesive. Groupthink is also more likely when a group works in relative isolation, when its power structure is dominated by a strong, directive leader, right? So when it is under pressure to make a major decision quickly, they link to the leader to make the decision, and the leader is guiding the group, right? So when we have this really, really relative isolation, they got one person at the top making all the decisions, then everybody in the group isn't able to kind of weigh on the decision. But when you have individuals who are kind of working together, everybody has kind of an equal say on what's going on and the decisions that are being made. that's when group cohesion is really, really great, right? Everybody knows their responsibility, their role in the group, and they make decisions based on the betterment and the success of that particular group. Okay, so that's all we got today. Again, we're talking about the importance of groups, the importance of how groups form, how they influence our behaviors, how they influence our attitudes. And as we've seen, um, we are and can be influenced by group settings more often than we think we are, right? It's really important that we are looking at and being cognizant of, again, how groups are affecting us, right? That cognitive dissonance plays a big role, right? What is that tension that we're feeling? What is that pressure that we feel as we go through life? There's going to be tension, and we have to be really cognizant of what's being forced upon us by the group. And again, as individuals, we have to be mindful about how we behave, how we move, how that movement and those behaviors influence our attitudes, right? And how our attitudes influence our behavior, right? So again, I'll stop here, but I hope you all have a great weekend. I'll post this to Blackboard here shortly, and I will see you all next week. You'll take care.